Hello there. Just want to do a quick stream to run through a little bit more of Scarlet Twilight 3 and maybe show you some of the previous issues. Hope you like what you see. If you haven't checked out the other parts of the campaign, you'll want to go head over to zoop.gg and check it out. But wanted to talk about a few things here. Just run through Scarlet Twilight 3, but also kind of take you through some of the things that inspired it. In this case, it's a little bit of comic book history and a little bit of actual history. So I'm going to start with where we're in the story. It kind of ran through Captain Lancet and the Maxis attacking the Scarlet Twilight, failing to get away with it, and having to retreat. So we run through there, kind of left it as they were escaping, got north up the Hudson River, and here's where we left it. So kind of did this Indiana Jones map thing to show they started Manhattan, headed up the river to get away, and their Zeppelin obviously was not in the best of shape, so it wasn't going to last forever. They make it about 30 miles north, which is pretty close to where I'm at here in Stony Point, New York. And that provided a really good bit of inspiration that reminded me of some older comics that ended up being a really good way to tie Captain Lancet's story together, coincidentally enough. So he lands in this environment here, which is actually based on the actual sort of battleground where the Battle of Stony Point took place. Interestingly enough, this has been featured in comics enough that I remember it growing up in Ohio being talked about. And back in the Silver Age, they even kind of went through and implied that he was an ancestor of Batman. It's pretty cool stuff. So pretty interesting tie-in there. Obviously, Batman was a pretty big influence as well to Wear Scarlet Twilight and a lot of the things. So I'll kind of pop back and forth and share where that informed the story and in which ways. So they get here. The Zeppelin is sinking. They decide this would be a good place to hole up, and pretty much would be. And being as it looks familiar, he starts to remember being at this battle. To give you a little bit of background on this battle, which I'll do in a minute, as Captain Lancet does, but they decide, hey, this is a good place to be. We collected everybody who survived. We're going to hang out here. He checks to make sure everybody's all right. And the color on these pages, I was not happy with initially, but going back to look at it, I really liked how they turned out. So I guess my first reaction there was not always correct. So we run through a few things here. I'm kind of doing some exposition, hopefully in as fun a way as possible, because I've been leading up to revealing, who Captain Lancet is, and we revealed in the last part of the third issue that he's Vlad the Impaler, more or less, and he's running through, and he's a vampire, and kind of runs through his experience being a vampire. He's not necessarily quite constrained to all the rules that normally vampires have to behave by. He can be out in the sun. He's kind of just sensitive to it. We kind of covered the same thing with blood. He doesn't he doesn't need to have too much blood. He's kind of gotten through that part of it. And the other vampires in the story are a little newer, so they're still kind of in that stage. And I gloss over a lot of things. To be a vampire and actually Vlad the Impaler, you'd have to be pretty evil. So he's not exactly that. And I kind of fudged the truth there a little bit to make the story work, because I did want to tie into that larger mythology, playing with a lot of big mythological elements here in terms of how we look at America in ways that tie in and harken back to those old comics. So when it came to the vampire stuff, it made sense to do the same thing. I had to go really big with with those elements. So he's kind of running through, it's all right. I don't really need to stay out of the sun that much. And we kind of introduced some doubt here. His sidekick, his clones that are his sidekick, Maxie, are a little bit affected by what they learned. They didn't really know who he was. They assumed he was a good guy. They didn't have too much of a problem with the vampire aspect. And but they're a little disturbed to find out that maybe he wasn't doing all this back in the day or now because he was just a hero that wanted to serve America and fight for justice and all that sort of golden age type stuff. So he's a little disturbed by what he's heard, and kind of for a few reasons. He thinks it's a little off to hear it, and he's surprised by it. He also thought to himself, well, we didn't really mean for you to have to keep doing this. If this was just something you did to get by, We don't want to make you do it forever. So he kind of gives him an out there. Maxie does, and says, if this fighting for Americans and freedom isn't what you were about, you don't have to keep doing it. We understand. So Captain Lancet responds, says, "Hey, you guys took care of me for a century while I was in a coma. That would be enough to keep fighting if it was down to that." And he kind of brings up, the loyalty that exists between these two characters. They're somewhat one-dimensional characters that I hope I get a little bit of depth through their story circumstances, not necessarily fully realized character things that they go through that you get in the sort of day-to-day superhero comic that you sort of see in Peter Parker or someone like that. So yeah, they kind of talk. You fought all. He's saying, hey, they offered you all this stuff to sell us out. You didn't take it. And he says, hey, fighting with a whole crime fighting routine back in the 30s was just a way to feed. Man's got to eat, right? You were decent enough to make sure you weren't hurting anybody who didn't have it coming, And I think that's kind of, if you look at those old comics, they were merciless on crime. They were like, yeah, the FBI ought to just be shooting these guys. It's very, it's not exactly the nuanced view we have of things today. So I kind of wanted to carry that through. And Maxie's reaction to this, he's not necessarily opposed to things in the way that we would maybe ought to be now. He's looking at it through what my recollection of those characters were back in, say, the 1930s and 40s, and how the viewpoints about certain things came across. So he runs through to that. He thinks about it for a second, says, actually, it really wasn't about the thirst. I didn't really need to be, drinking blood that much. This is something that was kind of a red herring with my entire story. Is I introduced sort of American elements and patriotic elements. I introduced, the vampire stuff, and the vampire stuff was, I think, in a way that makes a little bit of sense, actually not that important. It's not the biggest part of his character. He says, well, there's probably some proteins in eggs that worked out almost as well. Mentions that there was a place back in the day that made a good one that he liked, and that pretty much handled it for him. He didn't necessarily need to be out there doing the vampire thing. And hopefully I'm creating a little bit of suspense here as to, well, gosh, why were you doing this? I also wanted to throw in a reference to an egg cream. I just feel like that's a really weird old New York beverage I've never heard of except for things in that period. So it was kind of a interest. I just wanted to throw that in there. I felt like it just harkened back to like a lot of other things I toss in, some of those old stories and references in the time period. So this was the big panel. I was really excited to get to this, where he explains what he's all about, what motivates him, his character, all that stuff. And hopefully it's something that this is what he said about himself in the beginning of the story, that he was this guy. I introduced a lot of things that made you think he might not be. And then a lot of other stories that approach, these types of subject matters where the guy's got a dark secret. It doesn't necessarily go this way. And one of the things I really wanted to do when I sat down to do this story was to make it go this way, to make it be, he is a good guy. He is a hero. He's exactly who he said he was. So wanted to do a real heroic panel, light behind him, all that stuff. So it looks very, very, even though it's a quiet scene, somewhat substantial. And I hope that did happen. And he runs through what his motivations were. He says, well, it goes back a ways. In the Depression, things were looking rough. People were starting to think, does democracy work? All these things, which was happening during the time. And in fact, if you look at those old comics, there's a lot of political discussion just thrown in character dialogue, way more so than you'd think. It was something when I researched this stuff, I was really surprised to see, boy, they really, really leaned heavy on that. So he says, no, I started doing this because I had some abilities and I wanted to help, and help was needed. So he says, I've experienced the alternatives to democracy. He says, the truth is, Maxie, she was right. She doesn't have her details straight. And that's kind of my way of fudging, how evil Vlad the Impaler probably was in reality versus my version of him, which is highly sanitized. And again, that's something I think that American literature did a lot of in the 1930s and 40s. He says, she is right about who I was. I was that guy. I've masqueraded as a prince in America, but centuries ago in Wallachia, which is where Vlad the Impaler is from, I was a king. So he's going through, and while he is telling us, yeah, I'm truth, justice, and American way, 100%, I also am that guy. And kind of, I'm going to run through here in this scene and kind of explain how I make that fit together. That hopefully works at least in what I call comic book logic, if not like real logic. So I kind of fudged the truth on this character. He obviously didn't fight in real life, monsters and whatnot. But I feel like a lot of the brutality associated with him and the impaling aspect needed to be justified in the comic book by something bigger than just, oh, we're fighting the Ottomans or something like that. That's still pretty brutal and unacceptably so to like glorify, even though they maybe would have done something like that back then. I needed to kind of find a way to do that differently. And that worked, I think, for this aspect of Captain Lancet's character. But it also really worked in a way that sets up the next story in a big way that no one has figured out yet. And I hinted at it pretty hard. Like the information is on this page if you can figure out how he actually got his powers, which is going to involve a really cool character crossover I'm pretty excited about. But anyway, I'm saying he was, he's ruler of this kingdom. They had beasts and wicked magic and stuff like that coming at him. We got clearly like this big orc type guy. It says to defend my people and my land. It became as brutal as they were. So we have a cool shot of him here and what is kind of a Vlad the Impaler outfit, what he's historically seen as, but adapted to be, this ridiculously blonde hair, blue-eyed, Flash Gordon-looking guy that I've cast as Captain Lancet, which I feel like was a very American thing to do and hopefully worked. So we kind of show, he fights these guys. He took on these monsters. He was a great warrior. He does impale some of them. It's not something I feel like is okay just to happen to people. It's really maybe not okay to happen to monsters. I don't know if I want to litigate that, but it was a way for me to really sanitize the impaling aspect so I could tie it to that historical character and that big mythology to it without really darkening him too much. So he fought these villains off, these monsters, and he did this too. He's kind of sitting there. He's maybe not too happy about it, but he's done that. But there was some repercussions. A wizard came after him, maybe a super wizard even, and I kind of leave you to assume that this is in a revenge for this fight. He was on these guys' side and turned him into a vampire, probably the first vampire, and here he is in his vampire form. And then I kind of decided rather than doing the Dracula thing, which he was the basis in some ways for Bram Stoker's Dracula. He's not the guy that went to Carfax Abbey and harassed Jonathan Mina Harker and Van Helsing. He's Vlad the Impaler at that point steps off, that path. So it's kind of a way for me to bring in the cachet of Dracula and all the stuff that goes with that without really, he's like not that guy. He's stepped off there. He kind of Highlanders around, has adventures. And he says, drifted around for centuries and found myself here in America. And when my neighbors fought to free themselves from a king an ocean away, I joined them. He says, I fought on this very hill we stand upon and many others. I'd been in many battles, but this one brought a feeling of new purpose I'd never experienced. So we kind of, imply that he's been a warrior all his life, all that stuff. He was a king. He had people. He was a hero. At least my version of him kind of was a hero, but he realized when he was doing this, which he kind of just joined in to go along and get along, realized, no, this is really worth fighting for. This is something special. And I hope that really, I like that sense of patriotism because it was such a huge part of those old comics. And it was fun to throw in here and make it hopefully not too much of a surprise because, again, this is who I kind of told you he was at the beginning of the story and how he behaved aside from being a vampire and some of those other things. So he kind of gives a very Captain America-esque speech here. The struggle that was never perfect in America. It might never be, but we still want to keep fighting for it. And it's better than having a king. It's better to share responsibility and work towards equality. And gives this, hopefully, a good patriotic superhero speech. It was fun to write, and I hope it works out pretty well. But he goes in and he gives his reasons. And I think it is worth fighting for America. I think it is worth fighting against tyrants, whether they're kings from England or they're, horrible vampires. And he says, no, this is why I do this. This is not something I did just to have an excuse to drink blood or or to be savage and have an outlet for that. He did it because he learned through the centuries, through being the king, that he had to be responsible for doing all those things to defend his kingdom and then paying the price for it. He has some personal experience. He says, in this situation, everybody decides what to do. They share the responsibility. One guy doesn't have to decide to do horrible things and then have wizards coming after him in revenge, which is how he views what has happened to him. Not that he's too conflicted about it, but he has that. I've seen how it happens when one guy has to do everything. So that's hopefully, like I said, comic book logic enough to explain why he is, right up there in the sort of Captain America, Superman vein. So he's told us who he is, and says, in fact, I'm going to go right back down to Manhattan and fight them. And I'll do it after that if I need to. And references that his new costume, which we introduced in issue 2, is pretty torn up, which it is. Maxie says, hey, he's earned Maxie's confidence back completely here when explaining himself. He says, well, we're with you. Captain Lancet says, no, you've done your share, and then some. And for my plan to work, in fact, I'm going to need to do it by myself. So I hint at what his plan is here, and I'm not going to go into it completely now because it's going to spoil what I think is a great surprise in issue 4. Not to toot my own horn too much, but I think it comes out of the blue a little bit, but is definitely been built up to in a way that I think people are really going to enjoy. So I'm very excited for people to start reading issue 4, which as of a few days ago is done. And you can check out over at zoop.gg. The link is in the description, and we have all these issues that you're looking at now and have in previous videos, as well as issue 4, and a great hardcover collection that collects 1 through 4 with a ton of extra material. So again, please, if you haven't checked that out yet, please consider giving it a look. I couldn't be more excited about how the story wraps up, and I'm really pumped for people to check it out. So he kind of goes into this. The militia I joined had to take this hill we're standing on. There was a British fort there, and we were ordered not to match them gun for gun. And this is where I'm specifically calling back to this real historical event. It says, no, we snuck in with nothing but bayonets, traded our ammunition for stealth, and managed to take the fort. Now, this is exactly what they did at the Battle of Stony Point. They had a militia that was not an organized army versus some pretty experienced troops that took Kings Ferry, or held Kings Ferry, it was kind of the staging point for if they'd be able to attack West Point, they would do it from here. So it was very important for the Americans to get them out of Stony Point. What he did was, not having a great group of soldiers, came in with a really good plan. It says everybody goes in with bayonets, no ammo at all. We have to do this with stealth. We can't just line up and fight them gun for gun because we'll get massacred. And they came in the middle of the night, and this did in fact work. They were able to take the fort by coming in, without a frontal attack, which is, as Captain Lancet says, kind of what they tried to do. They decided, hey, we've got these ray guns, maybe we can take them out just by attacking with a somewhat good plan, which is what we saw in issue 2 and the beginning of 3. That didn't work. And Captain Lancet is thinking of this battle and maybe thinking of some parallel ways to attack that don't involve, matching their numbers and their power with, maybe some advancements in science or something like that, which is, like I said, what they had just done and did not see work out. So that's kind of what we're getting at there. I hope that was a fun way to bring in some real history. I think it really worked for the story. It's kind of a look back at, what I'm implying is Captain Lancet back in the Continental Army as some kind of officer. This was kind of fun to do like a Sin City-ish look at events that are way back in the day. And he's kind of explained, I've got a plan. It's a little out of the blue. I'm going to be doing it myself. And the Maxies come up and say, hey, we were able to get some stuff out of the old hideout, and we do have your old suit as your new one is torn up. So much like his battle plan is get back to basics, he's also getting back to basics in his old pulp 1930s outfit, which I think is a good, it just works out pretty well to kind of be doing that visually as well as plot wise. So he says, "Hey, we found a boat. We can take you back down." Again, I'm kind of playing into their old dynamic where Maxie was his driver, and we leave issue 3 on this look that I hope reads. It's really harkening back. I based the layout on that painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Made some changes, of course. Washington's just standing there in a picture. I wanted to have Captain Lancet grabbing an oar himself, so he doesn't just look like he's, uh, you know, sitting back and letting other people do the work for him. But I wanted to really steep this in patriotic imagery. That's the We revealed that that was Captain Lancet's motivation. He did care about America in very much, I think, the way that those old comics did. There was, obviously a lot of those even predate World War II, really breaking out in a large scale way back in the mid 30s. So there was a lot of tension about what systems of government work. Is this going to happen in America? You had characters having a lot of, I would say, somewhat detailed political debates within the dialogue of these stories. And this is very much a response to that. I wanted to find a way to do that worked with the plot, resolved the big question of who Captain Lancet is and why he does what he does, and hopefully do that with visuals like I'm doing here as well. So I think it worked. At least now, maybe I will think differently if I look back in a year and think, oh, this would have been a much better idea. But it was a fun way to bring in some real history. I think it worked perfectly with the plot, and I was lucky that that did kind of work out. So thanks for checking out the video. I'm going to do more. I'll probably do a preview of issue 4 that doesn't give away any of the good stuff, covers the first few pages, kind of goes in depth on some of the details and decisions that went into that in the next few days. In the meantime, please, if you haven't yet, like I said, check out the campaign on zoop.gg. The link is in the description. Like I said, a lot of good ways to read the story, to catch up with the story, fill in an issue if you missed it from one of the previous campaigns. We have you covered, so please check it out. I'm going to leave you with the trailer for issue number 4, and thanks for tuning in.